What is going on, APUSH people? We have a review video. This is part 1 covering periods 1 through 5, which is 50% of the new curriculum. I'm going to cover key terms, people, and events that are specifically mentioned in the new curriculum. As we go through, if it is bold, please know it. That means it is straight out of the new curriculum. Also, I'm going to ask you to check out all my other videos in the description. I have ones that match up with everything mentioned in here, just a lot more detail, plus even more. So this is your guide to be absolutely familiar with everything that you need to know for period 1. Before we begin, it's shout out time, and I'm going to give a shout out to you right there listening right now, watching this. Thank you so much for your support. I appreciate you watching my videos all throughout the year, and I hope this one is the most helpful of them all. All right, so let's get started. Let's talk about period 1, which is from 1491 to 1607, and let's jump to the test structure. This is roughly 5% of the exam. You will not see an essay exclusively on this period. Rather, you could see a topic that incorporates this period as part of a broader idea. So, for example, you could see an essay about the experiences of European countries in America during their colonization. That could include info from period 1. So why was 1491 to 1607 chosen for the dates, this idea of periodization? 1491 is 1 year prior to European contact. 1607 is the first permanent English settlement in Jamestown, Virginia. So much of the focus of this period is on native life prior to contact with Europeans and interactions between natives, Africans, and Europeans. That Columbian exchange that is oh so important. And look at that, we got our first bolded term, Columbian exchange. Guess what that means? It's in the new curriculum. All right, so let's focus on corn or maize, which is bolded. It was grown by natives in the southwest U.S. and Mexico. We're going to talk about that more in this period. The Great Plains of the Great Basin, they were located in the central part of the present-day United States. They had a lack of resources, which led to nomadic lifestyle. So right here in the plains in the Great Basin, not a lot of natural resources, so those natives were very nomadic. They were hunters. Down in the southwest, that is where your maize was being grown. The Columbian exchange is the exchange of goods, ideas, diseases, and people between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Definitely know the impact of the Columbian exchange on various regions. So the impact on the Americas, diseases impact natives, guns and horses transform native life by making hunting much easier, and also warfare more destructive. And you also see the emergence of racially mixed populations, mestizos, which are people who are of mixed Native American and European ancestry. What's the impact on Europe? Potatoes and maize led to a large population growth. We see an increase in capitalism and a decrease in feudalism as well. Definitely know the population growth. The impact on Africa, we have the slave trade, which leads to the Middle Passage, and specifically know that Spanish and the Portuguese were the first countries to begin the slave trade in West Africa. All right, the encomienda system. This is a royal grant of land by the Spanish crown to settlers. I do have a video on this. Settlers promised to Christianize natives, and this was eventually replaced with African slave labor. Definitely know that in the beginning, slavery really focused on natives, but then later was replaced with African slave labor. Autonomy is a word that's not necessarily an APUSH content word, but it's a very important word to know. It means independence or self-rule. And Africans and natives sought to preserve their autonomy after contact with Europeans. This will really be a big theme for Native Americans throughout history. They're going to want to preserve their autonomy. All right, let's jump on over to period 2. This bad boy is 10% of the exam. Essay topics could include, but are not limited to, comparing and contrasting European powers, characteristics of British colonies, and why was 1607 to 1754 chosen for the dates? Well, as we just talked about, 1607 is the first permanent English settlement in Jamestown, and 1754 is the beginning of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. This time period continues to focus on European colonization, with England representing a significant amount of focus. We're really going to dissect the English colonies in the Americas. All right, the New England colonies, will start out there. This was established by Puritans that sought a like-minded community, and there's a mix of agriculture and commerce. So we have this dude down here, John Winthrop. Although he's not specifically mentioned in the new curriculum, it wouldn't surprise me if you were to see a quote about him or by him. And the answer would be something along the lines of seeking to establish a like-minded community. So if you disagreed with the Puritans and their like-mindedness, you would be booted out of Massachusetts. Do you know? Can you identify 2 people who were? Take a minute, pause this, think about it. Yep, that's right. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, both of them were booted for challenging John Winthrop in the Puritan Church, and they were sent to Rhode Island. So they challenged that like-minded community. All right, the middle counties we're going to jump over to now, most notably Pennsylvania. They grew cereal crops, and they were religiously, demographically, and ethnically diverse. There was a lot of religious toleration in the middle counties. So if you see a question about which colonies were the most accepting or diverse, it's going to be the middle colonies all day long. Now think about it and it'll make sense. New England isn't getting a lot of non-Puritans because they're not fitting in this like-minded community. And the South is really only at this point getting a lot of indentured servants and or African slaves. So it's really the middle colonies that's going to focus on growing like wheat and different food crops. They are going to be the most diverse. So the Chesapeake colonies, that is Maryland and Virginia specifically, they grew tobacco. Look at tobacco, highlighted, it's bolded, you know what that means. And they originally relied on indentured servants and later African slaves. They relied on indentured servants up until about 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion, and they later were replaced with African slaves who do not get their freedom like indentured servants. Now the southern colonies and West Indies, this is your South Carolina, they grew staple crops or sugar, and they had a heavy use of slave labor. The days were much longer down there. The amount of sunlight in the growing season was much longer down in this area. The work was much more arduous, and in many cases, Africans made up a majority of the population, which would lead to strict slave codes. All right, the Pueblo Revolt. This is southwestern United States. This was a Native American rebellion against the Spanish because the Spanish sought to end native practices that were inconsistent with Christianity. You want more detail that I'm going to go in here? I got a video on that. Check the description. I got one for everything. The Pueblos rebelled, and they expelled or kicked out the Spanish for over 10 years. And this is a turning point because the Spanish eventually regained control, and they begin to advocate the religious assimilation or accommodation or accepting of natives. Now, this term Anglicization of the British colonies basically means the British colonies are acting a whole lot like Britain. So how do they do that? Well, it's the process, again, of colonies becoming or taking on British characteristics, and they do it through transatlantic print culture, whether it's books or newspapers that are being spread across the Atlantic, and also a huge increase in commercial ties between the two areas as well. All right, the Enlightenment. Holy cow, know this bad boy? I got a video on that. This is a focus on reason and intelligence. Individuals began to question forms of government, and specifically, they're really kind of beginning to question monarchs here. Are this the best monarchies? Is this the best form of government? Well, we got Montesquieu, who advocated separation of powers, or 3 branches of government. Here's how I remember it. Montesquieu, 3 syllables. That's how many branches he wanted. Our boy John Locke, he favored the consent of the governed, or the idea that the people have all the power, and he believed in life, liberty, and property, which Thomas Jefferson plagiarized and turned it into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mercantilism is an economic theory, and the goal is to make money for the mother country. In this case, it's Great Britain, and this focuses on a positive balance of trade that favors the mother country or Great Britain. All right, we're already on to period 3, 1754 to 1800. This bad boy is 12% of the exam, and essays could be on the 7 Years' War as a turning point, the American Revolution as a turning point, anything about the American Revolution, and comparing and contrasting the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. So why was 1754 to 1800 chosen for the dates? Well, 1754, beginning of the 7 Years' War. Huge turning point, as we'll see. 1800 is really, we're 11 years into government under the Constitution, and Thomas Jefferson becomes the 3rd president. His administration is sometimes seen as and his election is sometimes seen as a revolution of 1800. This time period focused on the shift in the relationship between the British and the colonists, which ultimately culminates in the American Revolution. Additionally, after that, we're going to focus on the structure of American government with the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. They're bolded. You have to know pretty much everything about it, but don't worry, I got you. All right, let's start off with the 7 Years' War. This was fought on one side, the British and the colonists, versus the French and many natives. And it was really started by this dude in the Ohio Valley near present-day Pittsburgh. That's George Washington. You ever start a war before? He did. Britain won, and France is removed from North America. Huge turning point. Definitely know that France is removed. They are gone, and Britain gains all of their land. This is a watershed event or a huge turning point. You want to impress the AP readers? Use the term watershed or major turning point. Britain ends solitary neglect and they begin to tax the colonies, which leads to colonial resistance. So from 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War, to 1776, the whole 13 years could be summarized as this. Britain ends solitary neglect, they begin taxing the colonists, and the colonists resist, leading to tension. That's your 13-year time period right there. Now, be able to identify or explain 2 new taxes in the colonist response. I'll give you one right now. The Stamp Act led to the Stamp Act Congress, and the Stamp Act was a tax on 50 commonly used goods against the colonists. The colonists formed the Stamp Act Congress. When you see the word Congress, that always deals with the colonists. Congress, colonists, Congress, colonists. They were protesting the Stamp Act. They were boycotting. This led to the repeal of the Stamp Act by the British, and then they issued the Declaratory Act saying they could pass anything they want in the future. Be able to explain these in either an essay or a short answer as a potential short answer. So we got our boy Thomas Paine. He came up one bullet too early, but he wrote common sense, and he said it was common sense for the colonists to break away from Great Britain. He was an Enlightenment thinker, and he said nowhere in this galaxy does a smaller body like Great Britain control a larger body like America. Guess what, America? You got to break away, is what he said, and this helped influence the Declaration of Independence. Speaking of which, this was written by Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin, although Jefferson gets most of the credit. This was inspired by common sense and Enlightenment thinkers such as Locke. There is Old Man Franklin, John Adams, and then Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. I'm 33. Boy, do I feel like a failure. This was a list of grievances against King George III, saying, hey, KG3, you know what? You kind of stink as a ruler. Here's everything you've done wrong. Now, the Colonial War for Independence or the American Revolution, the U.S. won in spite of loyalist opposition. There was a large amount of people who were loyal to the crown, and Britain had military and financial advantages. Now, they won in spite of that, but they also won because of support from Europe, especially France. Here's the Battle of Saratoga, this painting. And this is a huge turning point in the war in 1777. As a result of this, France begins to give support and aid to the United States to help defeat the British. So that's a reason why the U.S. was able to defeat the British. Also, the colonists had a deep ideological commitment, and they, in the U.S., we'll see later, it's very tough to win a war when the people you're fighting against believe to their core in what they're fighting for. The U.S. experiences this firsthand during the Revolutionary War, and then we'll see in future wars it's going to be on the opposite end. But this could be a great potential short answer question. Why did the United States win the war? Briefly explain one reason why the United States was able to win. So be able to be familiar with these. Guess what? They're bolded. You got to know it. I got a Revolutionary War video too for you if you want. And the 7 Years' War. Boom! All right, Articles of Confederation. I got a video on this one too. This created a very weak central government. It purposely created a weak central government. Why would they do that? We'll figure it out. Well, the government could not tax. There was no national military. In order to create a law, 9 out of 13 states had to agree. That's a high number. And if you want to amend the articles, it took 13. All 13 states were required. So imagine you and 12 of your best friends are going out on Friday night. But the only way you're going anywhere is if all 13 of you agree. And they all want to go bowling, but you're like, no, I want to see the hot new movie coming out. Guess what? You're not going bowling unless all 13 agree. Now, one of the few successes of the Articles of Confederation was the Northwest Land Ordinance. This created a process for admitting states into the Union once they reached 60,000 inhabitants. This also outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territory, which is up here. Your Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, etc. This was the first congressional ban on slavery in American history. And they also established public education, funds for public education in the Northwest. Education is important. They saw that. They established it. All right, so then that doesn't last very long, the articles, because there's too many problems. So we have the creation of the Constitution, which this dude, James Madison, gets a lot of credit for. The Constitution is based on federalism and separation of powers, which essentially means it prevents one branch of government from abusing its power. So the Constitution was created through a series of compromises with limits on national power. So we're going to talk about the compromises. Be sure you can explain them in an essay or short answer. The Great Compromise. This established our present-day bicameral or two-house legislature. One house is based on population, in one house had equal representation per state. That's the Senate. The one based on population is the House of Representatives. That combined the New Jersey and Virginia plans. If you don't know more about it, watch my video on the Constitution right now. Pause this, come back. The 3/5 compromise stated that 60% of slaves would count as population towards representation in the House. This was favored by the South because it allowed slaves to count towards population, thus giving the South more representation in the House of Representatives. The slave trade compromise outlawed the international slave trade after 1808. So for 20 more years, basically, they could import slaves from other countries, but that ended in 1808. Now, the Constitution did not deal with slavery. They actually postponed the solution and the problems of slavery to future dates, which we'll see in periods 4 and 5. Because the Constitution did not address it, ultimately there will be a civil war that's fought over it. The Bill of Rights is a list of rights that are guaranteed to individuals. This was added after the Constitutional Convention. This was not a part of the Constitution, the original Constitution. This could also be seen as a compromise because it was created to satisfy the anti-federalists to ratify the Constitution. People like Patrick Henry were like, no, we don't like this. The government could abuse its power. So the Bill of Rights were created to give rights to individuals. And then the anti-federalists were like, all right, we're down with this thing. All right, let's talk about the impact of the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. They reverberated around the world. With the French Revolution, this poor dude, he's about to get his head chopped off with that guillotine. That had to probably hurt. Maybe not. I don't know. And this was inspired by Enlightenment ideas as well. So you're John Locke, you're Montesquieu, who, by the way, was French. And this helped lead to divisions between Jefferson and Hamilton in the United States. This is the birth of the political parties, which some dude is like, hey, no political parties. We'll find out in a minute. In Haiti and Latin America, they experienced rebellions and revolutions as well. And this dude, Simon Bolivar, played a very important role in revolutions in Latin America. All right, George Washington's farewell address. He warned against the following. 1, foreign alliances. 2, political parties. And this helped, and tensions with Britain and France in the 1790s helped lead to political parties. So as Britain and France are fighting each other, some people in the United States, Hamilton, think the U.S. should stay out of it. And other people like Jefferson feel that the U.S. should help France because they were a buddy to us in the Revolutionary War. And after World War II, which we'll get to in period 8, the U.S. entered into peacetime alliances. And George Washington's like, guys, you basically had one job. I told you not to do 2 things, and guess what? You did them both. So thanks for listening to me, America. I'm only the first president of the United States. I don't know if he really said that. He didn't because he was dead. But if he did, if he was alive, he would have said that. All right, Republican motherhood. This encouraged women to raise children and instill Republican values in their families. And women gained more access to education as a result of this. We'll come back to this in a video when I do change in continuity over time with women. This is a very important concept to understand. Women were expected to raise children to be good little American citizens. Look at that, we're on period 4 already. The test structure, 10%. Essay topics could include reform movements inspired by the Second Great Awakening. That should be bolded. I'm sorry it's not. Westward expansion and impact on slavery. Impact of market revolution on regions of the United States. Market revolution should be bolded as well. My apologies. Why was 1800 to 1848 chosen? Well, we already talked about 1800, Jefferson's election. 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, which was a women's rights convention, a big turning point in women's history. This time period focused on the market revolution, the increase in democracy, and several reforms inspired by the Second Great Awakening. All right, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. These were the first political parties formed in response to Hamilton's financial plan and the French Revolution. And Washington was like, guys, don't form political parties. And they're like, no, bro, we're going to do it anyway. Now, the Federalists tended to be upper class, advocate a loose interpretation of the Constitution, meaning they could do anything that the Constitution did not specifically forbid. They were pro-British because they wanted to trade with Britain, and they favored merchants and like the bus or the Bank of the United States. So Hamilton, who is here, the Federalists were also called Hamiltonians. They loved trading with Great Britain. They were all about money. Democratic Republicans, also known as Jeffersonians, named after their leader, Thomas Jefferson, tended to be commoners, middle class, advocate a strict interpretation prior to the Louisiana Purchase, which we'll get to. They were pro-French because of their help in the Revolutionary War, and they favored farmers and disliked the bus or the Bank of the United States. Jumping ahead to the second party system, we have the Democrats and Whigs. Whigs were formed in response to King Andrew I, or Andrew Jackson as the Whigs called them. Democrats tended to be the party of the common man. They favored universal white male suffrage, the spoil system, or giving jobs to supporters, and they wanted lower tariffs. Democrats throughout history want to see tariffs go down. Democrats down. Democrats down. Democrats want to see tariffs go down. That didn't rhyme, but I'm going to move on to the Whigs now. They tended to favor tariffs, a strong Congress, the Bank of the United States, and internal improvements, which we'll talk about. This is all about my boy here, Henry Clay, his American system. Democrats, what do they want to see tariff rates do? Go down. All right, Louisiana Purchase. This is the beginning of Manifest Destiny in 1803, and you see it here in the white. This essentially doubles the size of the United States, and this has Jefferson switch from a strict interpretation to a loose interpretation of the Constitution. When we're talking about the Supreme Court in the early 19th century, they helped assert federal power over state laws and helped determine the meaning of the Constitution. Now, in the landmark Supreme Court case, Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall said, "It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is." The Supreme Court established a tradition of judicial review here, and the Supreme Court says what is constitutional and what is not. Be able to explain a court case that shows that the Supreme Court asserted federal power over state laws. I'll give you Gibbons v. Ogden. The Supreme Court ruled that the federal government, not states, controlled interstate trade. This dealt with trade on a river between New York and New Jersey. Check out my video on the Supreme Court and John Marshall for more info on that. Let's talk about slavery. In the South, it was defended as a positive good by people like John C. Calhoun up here. And the Second Great Awakening inspired many in America to achieve perfection. And this focused on secular reforms, especially abolitionism and women's rights. And we see women's rights in Seneca Falls. Now, those two reform movements, abolitionism and women's rights, are going to be linked. They're very, very important. Women that advocated women's rights often advocated abolitionism. Women that advocated abolitionism often advocated women's rights. Know that, know that, know that. Xenophobia is a fear of foreigners, and it's similar to nativism, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. All right, we're going to jump over to textile machinery. Definitely know at least one example of every one of these bolded terms here. Now, the spinning jenny allowed for an increase production in cloth. Steam engines allowed boats to go against the current, and it increased trade on rivers. Interchangeable parts invented by our boy Eli Whitney. This increased production of goods, and there is Eli Whitney. Canals, the Erie Canal led to an increase in shipping, and it helped connect New York City all the way over to Chicago through the Erie Canal and the Great Lakes. Railroads, especially in the 1840s, created faster shipment of goods and people, and really kind of negatively impacted canals. And there's the Erie Canal, if you ever wonder what it looked like. Look at that painting there. The telegraph was created, and this led to the spread of information more quickly across the United States. And agricultural inventions, be able to identify one or two of them. The steel plow helped farmers out in the Midwest break soil more quickly, and the McCormick Reaper allowed farmers to harvest their crops more quickly. All right, the American system. We got my boy here, Henry Clay system, that sought to unify the national economy. That's in bold, be able to identify that. So 3 parts. He wanted a Bank of the United States, or a bust. The second one, tariffs, which would fund internal improvement. So he wanted a tax on imported goods. That's a tariff. He wanted that for 2 reasons. 1, to protect American businesses. 2, to fund internal improvements like roads and canals, especially out west, where he was from in Kentucky. Now, although this sought to unify the national economy, it really just benefited the North and the Midwest more than the South. The South was so invested in agriculture, they did not industrialize much, and they were kind of left out. So we have migrants from Europe during this time. The Irish, as depicted in this picture here, they tended to settle in cities, and the Germans tend to settle on the frontier as farmers. And they settled in the East and the Midwest. This led to interdependence between the Northeast and the Old Northwest because so many people were going there. Keep in mind, they're not going to the South because it is so heavily agriculture and slave labor dependent. The market revolution is a transformation in how goods were produced. More were made outside of the home, and there was an increase in technology and transportation as well. So it's not just a revolution in the way goods are produced, it's also a revolution in technology and transportation, like railroads and the telegraph. All right, the National Bank tariffs and internal improvements, that's the American system there. That was really the major political issues during that time. And regional interests trumped national concerns. In other words, people really focused more on their region than they did the nation, what benefited or hurt them as opposed to what benefited or hurt the nation. The federal government attempted to assert authority over states, and this brought resistance. And we see this in the Hartford Convention and the nullification crisis. The nullification crisis was in the early 1830s when South Carolina nullified some tariffs. And they were nullifying a federal government law. And that was an example of resistance against the federal government. The Missouri Compromise, also known as the Compromise of 1820, was established in what year? 1820, that's correct. The Talmadge Amendment, this never passed, but it proposed for the gradual emancipation of slaves in Missouri. And this was overwhelmingly rejected by the South because they feared this could eventually lead to an end of slavery. So there are three parts of the Missouri Compromise. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. You have to know. 1, Missouri is added as a slave state. That's right here in yellow. Maine, up here, is added as a free state. And then we have this 3630 latitude line right here. Everything below it in the future would automatically be a slave state. Everything above it would automatically be a free state. This only applies to the Louisiana Purchase. Now, ironically, Missouri is above that 3630 line. So this was a process for admitting states in the Louisiana Territory. The number of free and slave states were equal at 12, so neither the North or the South could gain an advantage in the Senate. And this is only a short-term solution. We'll see in period 5, the compromise breaks down and is eventually repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision. All right, we're jumping to period 5, last one in this video. It is roughly 13% of the exam, so the largest part so far. Essay topics could include change in continuity for African Americans prior to the Civil War and during Reconstruction, the Civil War and Reconstruction as turning points in U.S. history, and why was 1844 to 1877 chosen for the dates? Well, 1844 was the election of James K. Polk and really the near the height of Manifest Destiny. And 1877 is the end of Reconstruction. So this time period analyzes the causes for and impacts of Manifest Destiny, including tensions, the Civil War, and ultimately the end of Reconstruction in 1877. All right, let's begin with Manifest Destiny. This painting, absolutely positively know it. I've seen it so many times throughout American history and on past APU exams. Just know it. It depicts Manifest Destiny. This is the belief that it was the U.S.'s God-given right to expand. And if you want more info on this, where I break this down, check out my video, Period 5, Key Documents to Know. It's in the description. This was built on a belief in white racial superiority and American cultural superiority. So the belief and many political debates were focused on this issue during the time. In the election of 1844, with Henry Clay versus James K. Polk, James K. Polk embraced Manifest Destiny. He was all about it. Clay wasn't so much, and that is a large reason why Polk won. The Mexican-American War could be seen as an example of Manifest Destiny. The U.S. gained the Mexican Cession, which is all this white land here. And this would lead to controversy over slavery in the territories. Now, the Wilmot Proviso was introduced, and this proposed that slavery would be banned in all land gained from the Mexican Cession. So all this Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California proposed all that would be, slavery would be banned from that. And that was a huge debate in Congress. It never passed, but that was a belief of many Northerners. All right, let's jump on over to Asia. The U.S. sought to expand trade to other areas of the world, especially Asia. We see Matthew Perry in Japan. Imagine if this Matthew Perry was the dude in Friends. Hey, Ross, what's going on? Want to go to Japan? And we see an influx in immigrants, old immigrants in particular. These are the ones prior to the Civil War, those Irish and Germans in particular. This led to a nativist movement that was very anti-Catholic. Irish tended to be Catholic, very anti-Catholic. And this nativist movement hoped to limit the power of the immigrants. This is seen through the Know Nothing Party, a political party that was created for the sole purpose of being nativist and hoping to limit the power of immigrants. And we see Millard Fillmore, a former president, actually running for president again as a Know Nothing Party candidate with Andrew Jackson's nephew, Andrew Jackson Donaldson, in case you ever wondered. All right, let's talk about new legislation that promoted national development. During and after the Civil War, we have acts like the Homestead Act in 1862, which gave 160 acres of land for a very low fee and sometimes free, and encouraged westward settlement. So it would encourage families to pack up their bags and move out west, settle the land, improve the land, and they would get the land for a very cheap price or free. The Morrill Land Grant sold land and provided money for colleges, so it encouraged education and the development of land out west. Abolitionists during this time period made up a small portion of the North, although they were highly visible, and they used many methods against slavery, including the following. Be familiar with them. 1. Fierce arguments. We have people like William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote his weekly newspaper from 1831 to 1865, The Liberator, and said that slavery should end immediately and slave owners should not be paid. He called for the immediate and uncompensated end to slavery. So be able to identify a fierce argument. Also be able to identify helping slaves run away, such as the Underground Railroad, and violence being used as well. We see this in John Brown's raid in 1859 or Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Abolitionists would use violence to try to end slavery. So how was slavery defended in the South? We talked about it earlier. It was seen as a positive good, John C. Calhoun argued. Also racist stereotyping. You had these minstrel shows with a character by the name of Jim Crow, who would be played by a white actor that would don blackface, and they would stereotype and mock African Americans. All right, so proposals to resolve the issue of slavery included the following. 1. The Compromise of 1850. This was created to address the land from the Mexican Cession, and the country was really on the brink of civil war. So we have 5 parts, and this is Henry Clay's last compromise, and he is 72 years old here, and here he is speaking on the Senate floor, and there is the Vice President Millard Fillmore in 1850. So 5 parts. Please notice I got a video on it. Popular sovereignty in the Mexican Cession, allowing people in that territory to vote on whether that area should be slave or free. A new, more strict fugitive slave law, which requires Northerners to be active in the capture of runaway slaves. The slave trade in Washington, D.C. was abolished, not slavery, but the slave trade. California was admitted to the Union as a free state, which gives the free states one more state than slave states in the Senate. And Texas was paid money to give up claims to bordering states. Texas was claiming parts of New Mexico and other states, and the U.S. said that doesn't belong to you. And Texas was ready to fight for it. So the United States paid them $10 million, if I remember correctly, to give up that land. So what were the impacts of the compromise? Well, the North detested the fugitive slave law, and this helped lead to the abolitionist movement and the non-enforcement of the law. These personal liberty laws were passed in the North, which did not allow jails or courts to be used in the capture of runaway slaves. Essentially, what the North was doing was nullifying a federal law. Another proposal was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So we have Stephen Douglas. He sought to build a railroad through the Nebraska Territory. So he proposed this act, which would allow for popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska. I have a more detailed video on this. What's the problem with that? That was above the 3630 line in the Louisiana Territory. So the expectation was that Kansas would be slave and Nebraska would be free. So this overturns the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now, Henry Clay was dead, but if he was alive, he probably would have said something like, Stephen, why are you overturning my compromise, bro? And voters turn out in full force in Kansas. Abolitionist voters turn out, and this leads to conflict, which is known as Bleeding Kansas. It's basically a small-scale civil war going on in Kansas. Another one is the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court. So this is an 1857 Supreme Court case that sought to settle the slavery question in territories. And the Chief Justice was Roger B. Taney, who looks strikingly similar to a wet golden retriever. Look at him. You can see it. I know you do. Look at that. Is that not a wet golden retriever? Okay. So what does the court rule? It ruled that African Americans were not citizens and they could not sue in court. Slaves were property and they could not be taken without due process. So in an instant, whether African Americans were free or slave, Roger B. Taney and the Supreme Court ruled that they were not citizens. This would have to be overturned with an amendment, which we'll get to. Court went further to say the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and that Congress could not regulate slavery in the territories. And the North was furious, and this increased tensions between the North and the South. This is 1857. We're 4 years away from the Civil War. All right, the Republican Party started as a sectional party in the North and the Midwest. It was made up of many former Whigs, And in the election of 1860, Lincoln is the Republican candidate, and he runs on a free soil platform, which means he was against the extension of slavery. It did not mean that slavery would end. Rather, it meant that he opposed the extension of slavery. So slavery is fine where it is, according to the free soil platform, but it could not expand. So what is the impact of this election? It is the immediate cause of Southern secession and ultimately the Civil War. So states start to secede when Lincoln is elected president. So we have the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation. Here's the reading of it with Lincoln and his cabinet. This freed slaves in areas of rebellion only. But what were the impacts? It changed the purpose of the war from preserving the Union to beginning to end slavery. It also saw an increase in black soldiers joining the military, and it helped keep Europe from aiding the South. France and Britain were going back and forth, particularly Britain, about aiding the South because of cotton. After the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, they couldn't because slavery was already illegal in Great Britain. And this could be compared with the Gettysburg Address, which talks about a new birth of freedom, or the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. So be familiar with that. So why does the North win? Well, they have eventually better military leadership in Grant and Sherman. They have effective strategies such as the Anaconda Plan. It's this blockade from the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, and various rivers. And this was a way to try to prevent the South from gaining supplies. Key victories, including the Battle of Antietam, which the Emancipation Proclamation was issued after, and also they had more resources and people than the South. All right, so after the Civil War, we have the 13th Amendment passed in 1865, and this abolished slavery, and there are people in Congress who were celebrating this. The South tried to get around it, however, with sharecropping, and sharecropping was when freedmen would work on farms and exchange labor for using land and housing. Half of their crops were typically given to the landowner. And sharecroppers had to borrow money to get started, and they would go to local stores that would give them loans at very high rates. This is known as the crop lien system. And many African Americans in the South were sharecroppers and were in perpetual debt. When we're talking about radical Republicans, we're talking about Thaddeus Stevens, this dude here in the picture, and Charles Sumner. They sought to increase the power in the South and increase rights for African Americans. Eventually, long-term, they were not successful because Reconstruction ended in the Compromise of 1877, and the North's waning resolve to assist African Americans. Waning resolve is specifically mentioned in the new curriculum. Know the term waning, which means to decrease. So no autonomy and no waning. What does autonomy mean again? Yep, self-rule. Very good. Waning means to decrease. So the North's resolve is decreasing to assist African Americans, mostly because of the Panic of 1873, which causes financial distress on the country. All right, 14th Amendment. This granted citizenship to African Americans and those born in the U.S. This effectively overturns the Dred Scott decision. It also provided equal protection of the laws. The 15th Amendment, the final amendment in the Reconstruction era, the 13th, 14th, and 15th were those three. This provided suffrage for all adult males, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude or if they were slaves. So what were the impacts of these amendments on the women's rights groups? Well, the women's rights groups became split. Some favored providing suffrage for blacks prior to suffrage for women, and others did not support it unless women were granted suffrage as well. Remember what I said earlier. Women's rights and abolitionism were closely linked, and now the group gets split because some women say the 15th Amendment should not pass unless women are allowed to vote as well. So what were other impacts of the amendments? Well, rights were stripped away from African Americans over time through the following. Segregation or Jim Crow laws, which was upheld by the Supreme Court cases such as Plessy versus Ferguson, we'll get to that in period 6, and that established a separate but equal doctrine, that separate facilities or separate waiting rooms or facilities for African Americans were okay as long as they were equal. They never were equal. Southern states tended to focus on separate, not equal. They also were stripped away. Rights were also stripped away through violence, such as the KKK and the White League, and lynching of many African Americans in the South. Local political tactics included poll taxes, which required African Americans to pay to vote. literacy tests, which required them to pass a test to vote, and grandfather clauses, which exempted whites from paying poll taxes or literacy tests. And in the future, when we get to the Civil Rights Movement in Period 8, these amendments will be used to uphold civil rights, although in the short term, the rights were stripped away. All right, guys, that is a lot of bullet stuff from periods 1 through 5, 50% of the curriculum. I hope it helped. Please come back and check out part 2, which focuses on the other 50%, periods 6 through 9. Thank you for watching. Again, I can't stress enough, if it is bold, know it. It is mentioned in the new curriculum. Please check out my part 2 video and lots of videos in the description. Good luck on the exam in May. You are brilliant. You're studying. You will do very well. I promise you. Just take your time, know the stuff in bold, and you will do great. And of course, don't forget about Henry Clay after APUSH. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I appreciate you guys very much watching. I'll see you back here for period 2, and have a good day.